Hey, Yasmin.
Hi, Abby.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, too.
So, renters.
Let's talk renters.
Hmm.
We have been skirting around this subject and talked about it a little bit in our other podcasts,
Hmm.
but I think it's worth doing a little bit of a deep dive on renters. I don't know about you, but every time I'm at a conference, every time I'm speaking, the number one question is how do we support renters?
Same with me. Sometimes it's almost like a gotcha question. They're like, oh, yeah?
Uh,
What about renters?
What
So,
about renters?
I
Renters. So,
agree.
okay, so I would love to kind of detail out from our perspective some of the challenges and opportunities with renters and get your thoughts. So, first of all, the risk for renters, and the big thing about, for anybody who's not familiar, the reason that renters present a unique challenge for fully subsidized retrofit programming, which is what we do for folks in low income who are in energy poverty. The reason renters are this big question mark is because there is a perceived and potential actual risk for renters that their rent will increase as a result of these upgrades, and or they may get rent evicted by their landlord as a result of the upgrades. These are real risks for renters if we are going into their home and providing upgrades free of charge for their landlord. Um, we don't want negative things to happen. Do no harm,
Hmm.
it is really what we say.
Hmm.
And so the sector and governments and utilities are really aware of this. And this is some of the reasons there's a big question mark. Now, renters have different protections in different regions of the country. Depending where you rent your home, you have different rights. And that's probably a whole other conversation. But
Hmm.
so every region is different. In BC, for instance, there's lots of protections around renters that really protect not only from raised rents because of retrofits, but for other reasons too. The provincial government has put in a safety net for renters that makes it very hard for landlords to raise rent or renovate. In other areas of the country, there's really not that safety net at all, and landlords can raise the rent by 40%, 50%. There's no cap,
Yep.
regardless of energy retrofits or not.
Hmm.
And so there's different risks for renters across the country. Now, when it comes to home retrofit programs for low income households that are fully subsidized, when it comes to processes and operations of the programs can retrofit renter homes all day till the sun comes up. There is zero issue in actually doing the work in the
Right.
home.
Right.
We can get renters in. The process would be a renter would apply. We would know they're a renter. We would give that renter a form for their landlord to sign because we are making upgrades to their home.
Mm.
So important for them to have understanding. On that form, it would say, I, the landlord, cross my heart and hope to die. I will not, I will not raise the rent
Yeah.
and I will not renovate. Obviously, a lawyer would put that differently, but
Yeah.
that's really what those forms say.
Hmm.
Those forms come back to the program, and then we go into the home and we do all those retrofits. Done.
Mm.
The big question is how do we enforce that form and that agreement if the landlord chooses
To
to
renege.
break his promise,
Yeah.
his or her promise?
Hmm.
That's where the challenge is.
Yeah.
What happens and who holds that landlord accountable? And there's a risk profile that is a spectrum depending on the upgrades of the home. So this risk changes. If I have a program and I'm installing 5 light bulbs and faucet aerators and a bit of air sealing, that risk is low,
Hmm.
right? The landlord's probably not going to do it as a result. If I'm putting $25,000 worth of upgrades in that home, the risk is different.
Yep.
So there's like a x-axis
Hmm.
of risk.
Hmm.
There's a regional risk. And then the question really comes, who is going to take on that risk?
Right. Whose
Because
responsibility is it?
whose responsibility is it to enforce that agreement with the landlord, and what is going to happen? Right now, if we did renters in our programming, that risk falls to the renter,
Mm-hmm.
right? They take all the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And then nobody wants that to happen. Our perspective from doing this work is that this risk should be held by some level of government. Government has the ability to they do this in other places, right? If a landlord or somebody breaks a promise, breaks a contract, there are ways to enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that is, and this is really where local governments, I think, can really make a difference to create this place and the structure of enforcement for these landlords,
Mm-hmm.
because renters shouldn't take the risks. Program implementers can't take the risk and won't take the risk. Communities can't take the risk. It has to be a government, and whether that's local, provincial. Or federal,
mm-hmm.
because we have heard in the last budget that there is a Renters' Bill of Rights coming down.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that looks like, but based on the name, it sounds like this might be a place where something like that could live.
Yeah. Common misconceptions about renters. I think that a lot of the general public thinks that social housing is where most renters live, and that's not true.
Right.
Like a vast majority, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in my memory, like 4 out of 5 renters are in like private market rentals.
Homes, yeah.
Just homes. And like 2/3 of renters are like low-income households, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
2/3 of low-income households are renters, 2/3 of renters are low-income households. Renters are like 3 out of 4 renters live in a house that was built before energy efficiency was a part of building codes.
Yeah.
So they tend to self-select into older, inefficient homes. And they also tend to live in homes that are difficult to heat and cool. So like, through baseboard heating or like radiant heating, overwhelmingly more likely. And also more likely to live in apartments and things like that. So like a combination of factors makes renters in some ways in Canada like a really like a prime demographic for improving well-being improvement through energy efficiency. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but energy poverty is a set of social economic problems that you can address by improving energy efficiency and improving people's well-being. So renters are like up there. So it is, and because of the things that you're highlighting, it's perniciously, they're also excluded from most provincial utility programs, in part because of complications and challenges like this. So can you help me think through? So maybe we'll start with like each level of government and then see what the roles and responsibilities might be in something like this. And I'll try to draw from like examples in the United States and what they're doing on some of these things. So do you want to start at local or federal?
Start local.
Okay. So municipalities, I'm hearing that a lot of municipalities around the country are now trying to come up with a renoviction bylaw. And so just to, I guess, quickly explain, renoviction is eviction in the guise of renovation.
Yeah.
And so if you have to make change to your house, you need there to be no occupancy. You move someone out and then they don't get to come back in, because by the time they come back, the rents have gone up and stuff. So I know in BC, they have, at the provincial level, they have a law that prevents or I should say minimizes renovation, because you have first right of refusal to come back to the home. So if your landlord forces you to move out because they're making upgrades to the home, you get to choose whether or not you want to come back to that house at the same rent.
There's also, sorry, just to jump in BC, they stipulate that unless your renovations that you're doing have to make the home unlivable for more than like 48 hours, or they have a time frame. So if you're just switching out windows, that's a 6-hour job. That doesn't count. and most retrofits don't take 48 hours. You can switch out heating systems in a day.
And they're also, I agree. And there's also punitive punishments for landlords who get caught by falsely evicting people for renovations, and then so there's a cooling period of like a year, I think, or something. And if they try to rent to someone else and they get
That's
caught,
right.
they have to pay like a year's worth of rent and damages. And so that's in BC. I'm sorry I jumped to provincial, but
Yeah.
where do you see the municipal role in provinces in Alberta, where my
Yeah.
understanding is, in Saskatchewan, where there aren't provincial protections? So do you see the municipality then sort of?
Taking on the, I think there's a couple things. So yeah, I mean, BC has the protection of the province. So City of Vancouver, City of Surrey, City of Victoria don't have to worry about putting
Hmm.
those protections in place for any programs. Those, it's all just baked in the ecosystem of that province. So kind of lets the municipalities off the hook there. In Alberta, I think creating policies that allow the city to either hold landlords accountable and or pay back some of the funding, the
Yeah.
program funding that has embedded. Because I think the other thing is that I didn't say, but there's a bit of an assumption that landlords are the bad guys, right? This kind of, we're very much, of course, we all want to protect renters, but not all landlords are like this. There's a lot of really great landlords out there who want to do the best for their renters,
Hmm.
but we want to make sure that we're doing no harm. And so, whether if I'm a landlord and I feel like I need to raise my rent or I need to renovate, maybe there's other reasons, maybe I have to pay back
Mm.
the $15,000 that the city put into my home. And
Hmm.
maybe that's the agreement that says, I promise to not raise the rent for 5 years. And if I choose to break that promise, I now owe the city
Right.
that money. We have property taxes that we all pay our cities for.
Hmm.
So there's mechanisms for cities to get money from their residents.
And that acts as a kind of a selection pressure to, if nothing else, I think what it does is that it filters in the good landlords who are trying to do this
Yeah,
for, I guess, the right reasons. Because if you're a landlord who anticipates perhaps selling the house or moving your family in or something like that, maybe you don't want to lock yourself into a program where you'll have to pay the money back. And you have very little control over what
yeah.
goes in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important that we're not just creating these structures that lock in landlords and then choke our program so that no renters are able to access, because all the landlords are like, there's no way I'm
Hmm.
signing off on this. So it's a has to be a balance. It has to be a reasonable balance that considers the needs of landlords and their ability to rent their suite in a fair way.
Yep. In the city of Ottawa, they have we've talked about this in a previous episode, but they have a low interest financing program as a part
Hmm.
of their Better Buildings Ottawa. It used to be for homeowners, and they've expanded then since to include landlords as well. And
Hmm.
that's one of the mechanisms they have, is that they reserve the right to pull that loan back
Right.
if the landlord breaches the contract by increasing the rent above a certain amount or something.
Yeah.
So that is an enforcement mechanism, and that acts as a kind of selection pressure against the landlord of increasing the
Yeah.
rents, and they have to kind of account for that when they make that decision. It's the only program at the municipal level, as far as I know, in Canada that
Yeah.
has an what we call an affordability covenant to kind of protect
I think you're
renters
right.
like that.
The the other thing is that there are ways to design a program to mitigate this risk
Hmm.
between landlord and renter. So things like making sure that the renter knows that the landlord is signing up for this. Your landlord has signed and this is the agreement that they signed. So if anything happens, here's the process for you.
Hmm.
And then letting the landlord know, okay, we're going to be your renter is transparently knowing that you are making this promise. So just keeping it above board and creating, I think things like that mitigate the risk for renters by being super transparent between the landlord and the renter.
Yep, makes sense. And then giving them like the capacity to then kind of take action and or
That's
follow a
right.
path to resolve these conflicts through mediation or something like that would
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. And I think it's really tough in markets where rent rent is so high
Mm,
and it's very hard to find a rental place. Landlords have a lot of power
yep.
and renters really don't in so many ways. And so I think there's not going to be a silver bullet. I think that's also a really,
Yes.
there's not a silver bullet. There is going to be a risk.
Yep.
We we cannot do this for renters without there being a risk. And
Yep.
there is a risk, so we have to be okay with that risk. We have to mitigate that risk as much as possible. But in no world does it exist where there will not be a risk.
Right. And so there, in addition to the risk for the tenant, there's risk for the landlord, but there's
Exactly.
also a reputational risk for your program.
100%.
No one wants to end up on the front page of CBC, right? Like that's the, for no
Yeah.
fault of your own. If you end up in a situation where, there's, I don't know, let's just think this through. You go retrofit 50 homes, and then landlords are then, for bad luck, they all end up evicting renters. Now they're
Yep.
homeless. It's just a bad story, and you have enough homes that are knocking on your door that need upgrades. So for you to step out of your like that zone, for you to take on the risk is also unreasonable.
It's just not,
Yeah.
yeah, we just wouldn't.
Yep.
We can't as
Hmm.
an organization. Yeah, reputational risk is really huge, not only for us, an organization like us, but for cities, for
Mm.
any sort of stakeholder
Institution. Yeah.
institution that's part of it. Yeah, nobody wants the front page to say, I signed up for this low income program and then my landlord jacked up my rent and evicted me. Like,
Yep.
nobody wants that.
For sure. And so the provincial level seems to me a little bit more clear on what the roles and
Mm,
responsibilities are, because housing largely falls under the province.
right.
Landlord tenant boards, residential tenancies boards, and stuff like that. There's some challenges there in some provinces. They're backed up a little bit and there's a backlog of
Yeah.
issues in front of them. But what is interesting to me here is that, oftentimes, like a rental, like energy efficiency and like tenant rights are like seen as being in opposition. But there is like
Mhm.
a one step, two step thing here where I think one thing can advance the other thing. Because right now,
Yeah.
your ability to deliver whole home retrofits is constrained by the limitations of like where like renters have protections. If we advance tenant protections in some provinces, then
Then,
we can advance energy efficiency, right? Like it's that one step, two step
absolutely.
walk that I
Yeah.
think we can take, and because there isn't, and because it's not within the purview of utilities, which are what are
Yeah.
typically delivering energy efficiency programs, or you, then because of that step, you're being held back, and so it's like,
Yeah. And it's kind of
hmm,
a blanket approach that if the province can put that blanket and that safety net in, then cities don't have to worry about they don't have to do those covenants because that's taken care of at the provincial level.
yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. It just unlocks ambition at the municipal
Oh,
level, so
yeah,
they can then do the program, and the
yeah.
province can. Now, here's a question, and I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask you this: in a province where there is no provincial policy backstop, is a private contract a mechanism to do this? Now, so the contract would be, I'm a landlord, you're a program delivery agent,
Mhm.
right? So it's a private contract between you and I. And people enter into private contracts all the time. Like any business transaction, is a private contract.
Yeah,
And then if you breach the contract, then I can sue you and seek reparations and stuff like that. So if I am a landlord and then you are a program delivery, so you and I sign a contract, a private contract that says I am installing $25,000,
right.
$10,000 worth of thing, and in return you will do blah 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 blah, not increase rents for 5 years, something like that, and then name the tenant as a co-party to your end of the contract as another beneficiary. So if I, as a landlord, breach the contract by increasing the rent, the tenant can sue me in like civil court because of, and so that's what they do in the United States, is my understanding. is that they have an affordability covenant is a private contract. So when in many states in the US, they don't have like a separate residential tenancies branch court. They go to
Right.
just, the,
Right.
the,
Okay.
the normal court. And so there they can argue and show that there's an existing contract that kind of it goes in tandem with the lease contract, and the
Right.
landlord is in breach of a private contract and to seek reparations through something like that.
I think from our point of view, as a delivery agent, we would want to minimize our risk and not just risk, but costs, the administrative process for us to set up the ability to, if that goes sideways and then we're in court, you can imagine the risks and the insurance that we would need to take on to do that, which just gets passed on to increase the cost of our programming.
Yeah.
So I think there is something to be said for creating an agreement between the landlord and the tenant that is stapled to the back of the lease agreement. And maybe it's stamped by the fund, either the province or whoever's funding the program, as a party. And I think that goes back to that transparency piece between landlord and tenant to say, like, okay, you guys are you've agreed to this, but it's the enforcement. It's not so much what that paper says. It's what happens if somebody breaks their promise.
That's exactly it. And I have been trying to figure that out, talking to my colleagues in the United States where they've had a longer history and more examples of this. They can't report of no one knows of a circumstance in which this breach has happened. That doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means that like some of these are untested. Like there's
assumptions, right? We're like trying to create this solution to mitigate this risk that we're not quite sure of. I just recently saw a CBC article that talked about landlords in Ontario, and it was something like, and I'm just trying to remember the stats, but something like 80% of landlord evictions or rent raises were done by 8 landlords.
Just 8, not 8%, just 8 number.
Like,
wow.
Like it's a small portion of landlords are doing these things.
Right.
And so I think there's, like, if it were me, I would look at landlords who are coming into my program and say, what's your track record? How much have you increased your rent over the last? Are you likely to increase your rent? What's your risk profile for our program? Do we feel like you are one of the good guys or not? I think there's ways you could do it, but there's risk. There is inherently risk.
And it especially in a private market rental situation where, like you said, and the governance and institutional mechanisms are not very clear. And this is why in most provinces that have a low-income energy efficiency program, they love working with social housing providers.
Right.
In large part because there's like, scale and volume, right? So you go to one tower, you hit, 220 units, but also because like the governance mechanism is relatively easy because they are already enforced kind of rent maximums.
That's right.
They are rent geared to income units. So your rent is capped at a percentage of your income. And they have formal asset management plans and stuff. So like they just have a long history of working together. That's not the problem. There is things to be said about there, but it's the private market rental where sometimes it's kind of like the Wild West.
Well, maybe if there's like a program for private landlords to sign up as an affordable landlord, and maybe they get tax breaks and they are able to participate in programs like this because they have been sort of checked in the process there.
So let's talk about the federal government then. What role do you see the feds playing?
Well, they are the ultimate opportunity to really create process for across the entire country.
Right.
So instead of trying to do this city by city by city by city or province by province, territory by territory, we can just do it in all one fell swoop with the federal government. So that's the opportunity. I do think this covenant protections, whatever it's called.
Affordability covenants.
Affordability governance is a place to play. We all pay, there's mechanisms for citizens to also provide money back to the federal government too.
Right.
And so it could be a similar agreement to say the federal government will pay for your upgrade. If it goes sideways, you have to pay it back. And it goes on your taxes. CRA happily sends millions of letters saying we owe all money. I think there are ways to do it. They're not easy.
No, none of this is easy.
We're not saying that this is easy
but doable, perhaps.
But what, sorry?
But doable, perhaps.
Doable. It's doable. But it does require some creative thinking. Mm-hmm. And doing things a little bit differently. But we're not going to get a different solution unless we do something differently.
Unless we try something different, yeah. I think I agree with that. And I think there's another role the federal government can play, and which is like elevating the ambition of provincial governments. So if they had a bunch of funding and they said, we will give your province blah, blah, blah amount of money if you had rental protection, tenant protections in place, because then we can do this program for renters. And that might, maybe in some cases it might not, but that might elevate the ambition, or at least standardize practices across the country, right? Have a uniform, like a language for these contracts.
Yes.
That are enable
capacity. Right. And that's also, the federal government could help support provinces to do that.
Exactly.
Provinces could also support cities. If provinces don't have that protection at a provincial level, they could also set something up to help the cities in the province create these.
I agree. And I think another, that's right. So it's like the subsidiarity, I think, is what I'm going back to my grad school in geography. Subsidiarity, I think it's what it's called, is that like nested sets of responsibilities. And actually the other, I'm going to come at this like maybe like curveball, is one thing the federal government could do is universal building labeling. And so if we had, like in the UK, almost every building, public, private, is labeled on a grade from A being the best, most energy efficient homes to like G being the worst. F is failing and G is like below failing. You can go look up the rating for every house in the country, and you're required. And in France, you're required to list that on the equivalent of the MLS system when you sell a house, or when you rent a house, when you buy a house. Now, if we said you're not allowed to buy, rent out or sell a home if it falls below F or G, but we will give you a small grant, $3,000, $5,000, like it should be within the margin, average case of taking that home up a level, then I think that is a unique role the federal government can play, is that then we're identifying landlords that have the worst performing homes. And if you're spending some public money in bringing them up to a certain minimum acceptable standard of F or E, let's say, then we have kind of brought up the quality of housing stock, which is a public good. And then we can use that as a mechanism. We can use this energy efficiency funding as a mechanism to lock in affordable rates for those housing for another 4 or 5 years. So like it's that one step, two step thing. So now you can use energy efficiency funding to increase like rental protection for at least those homes. And then over a period of time, like you can say E is like, if you say F and G for the next 5-10 years, we'll get rid of all F and G homes, or not get rid of, but you know what I mean, elevate the, and then maybe after 10 years, we then go from there to go like, you can DB, and then just move the quality of homes and push it up.
The other thing, I really like that. I think labeling is also not a perfect solution, and there are challenges with it. But I think it has a place to play in the rental market for the reasons that you say. The other reason is creating transparency for renters of what their operating costs are in a rental unit. We hear from so many people who rent suites and walk through the suite, and the rental market is insane. So, they're trying to get what they can get. And then 1 month later, they're looking at bills that are really challenging to pay, and they had no idea. And so I think labeling and requiring transparency specifically for rental suites. I think the homeowner and buyer market is different.
Yep.
But I think there's a place for labeling to play to support renters.
And so requiring landlords to disclose the
Yep.
last 12 months of bills, which is
Yep.
relatively easy to
Great.
get,
Yep.
these days. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I shouldn't say that actually. It could be challenging because the bills could be in the previous tenant's name and the landlord might not have access to it. But that's the role for policy then, right? Is to
That's right.
enable those kind of transactions to happen.
Yeah.
So last question for you. We hear whispers and rumors. Well, it was in the budget, but we hear whispers and rumors that there's a federal affordability program that's going to come
Yeah, the whispers.
starting next year, and then it's going to be for low to moderate income homeowners and renters. So, what's on your wish list for that program?
I think a lot of the things that we've talked about on this podcast are really in the wish list. I think I'm so happy that they're including renters. It's not an easy thing for all the reasons we talked about today, but I think it's so important. I think there's so much good happening in this country already when it comes to supporting folks in energy poverty. And I would hate to see this new program cannibalize the good that's already happening. What I would love is for the funding to lift up what's happening and to fill gaps of what's happening. We've talked so many times that nobody understands these issues and challenges more than the people living them. And so really engaging with the communities to help design the solutions and to do things like outreach and engagement and education as part of this program. The other thing from a program design point of view, this program really should measure success based on how much money it is saving people on their bills.
Actual measured savings, not
how much money are we saving? Because this is a low income program, and if that is not what we are, the North Star that we are all driving to, what is the point? We all talk about how much money we spend.
Yeah.
$50 million, $800 million, $1 trillion. It doesn't matter. What is the impact of that money? And what is the impact to these vulnerable households? How much money is going back into their pocket?
Right.
So really thinking about designing programs that have an affordability focus. Yep. That's fine. What's yours? What is on your wish list?
Oh, man. I mean, you covered most of the ground that I was going to cover. I was hoping, and I could be wrong about this might not be the mechanism, but I was hoping that there would be some element of emergency and assistance as well in terms of helping people get caught up on their arrears and things like that. I mean, in as much as energy efficiency helps in the long term, some households face like really acute situations. And one high bill can just put their just entire budget cycle and cycles of debt into and out of whack.
Yeah.
And so there isn't, like in the US, they have a low income energy assistance program federally. Would be nice to have.
Right. To the energy efficiency program. Exactly.
Yeah. I'd like to see something like that. I would love for the program to be like in the United States, designed in a way that invites funding from provinces and cities and private foundations. In the US, you could take the LIHEAP money, the Heating Assistance Program money, and the Weatherization Assistance Program money, and then municipalities can package them into like programs for specific demographics. And we've talked about this before, the Aging in Place Efficiently program to help low-income seniors get access to not just energy-efficient upgrades, but just like lifestyle upgrades like anti-skid bars and anti-slip floors and ramps and so on. There's programs in other programs. I have a whole list of programs that are doing similar things. Is taking federal dollars, combining it with like provincial public health, community health dollars, and throwing their own money into like pulling together packages for people with long-term illnesses, people with disabilities, and then different demographics, or people with like different vulnerabilities, needs. That's a big wish list. But
I was just gonna say, I think the point is, don't be prescriptive about how that money is being spent.
Yeah.
Be prescriptive about your goals.
Yes.
We want this much money saved per household,
Yep.
and then give it to the folks who are closest to those communities to spend that money in the way they know best to
Absolutely right.
achieve your goals.
Yep. 100%. Yeah. Set high level goals and targets.
Yep.
And work with the communities, and chances are that in some communities they might not have the capacity of someone like Cambo to do this. So work with them to build their capacity over
Yeah,
the years and
totally.
help achieve those targets. Yeah. So and very clear, transparent metrics on. Oh, I think you already covered this, but like just make that publicly available, and then use that to like elevate the practices of like provincial programs on like here's the benchmarks, here's what's reasonable to expect from the first year of programs, and
Yeah,
that's all.
we really don't have that in Canada. It's very much shrouded in secrecy of what baselines should be or what anyone could expect from these programs. And yeah,
Next episode.
I like it.